Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever. I invite you to close your eyes if you have not already, and just begin to gather your awareness from the outside world, turning it inward, coming into that inner sanctuary where our peace abides, that inner sanctuary which is untouched by the happenings of the world and our individual lives. To let go of the activities of the world, to let go of the effort it took to get here this morning. And we bring our awareness fully into this moment. This moment where we are exactly where we're meant to be. We have everything that we need, and all is well. Take a moment to notice your breath. Just allowing the breath to naturally slow down. You're aware of your breath taking from the chest, bringing it down into the abdomen. Breathing in the breath of God. Breathing out the breath of God. The very source that animates the body, that animates our mind. goodness. Amen.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see skies of blue and clouds of white, the bright blessed day, the dark sacred night, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of people going by. I see friends shaking hands, saying, how do you do? They're really saying, I love you. I hear babies cry. I watch them grow. They'll learn much more than I'll ever know. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Yes, I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
Thank you, Bree. Thank you, Sean. That song always touches me and brings tears to my eyes. And when I found out I was going to speak a couple of weeks ago, I came to Sean and I said, is it possible that we could have Bree sing that song? And you guys did, I mean, way beyond my expectations. So thank you so much. That song was a meaningful part of my childhood. I remember watching Louis Armstrong singing that. And a couple of months ago, I came across the original recording. And again, my eyes filled with tears because at the very core of us, we know that we live in a wonderful world, but we can lose sight of it. So his opening line, I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and you. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Do you ever think to yourself, what a wonderful world? You know, one of my favorite poets was Mary Oliver. She passed just a couple of years ago. And she wrote a lot about the natural world, which I really connected with. And one of the things that she said was, you know, there really is no reason that our Creator created such a beautiful world. If you look at the different shades of green of the trees and the red of the roses, there's no real purpose for that. I mean, it's not functional. We could live in a world very gray, very dark, and instead we live in this vibrant, beautiful world that's been created for us. And the other thing that she said is that if you look close enough, you know that you are connected to all that has been created around you. And I thought about that. Why would our Creator create such a beautiful world? First of all, we have the ability to take in the world. So we have these, you know, incredible receptors in our eyes. We have a mind that can process the beauty that we see, so that when we stand at the edge of the ocean, we are standing in awe. When we stand at the foot of a mountain, we see the majesty and it touches us. And I really believe that the reason that it touches us is it makes us realize that we are part of something so much greater than ourselves. And if you look at nature, there's really no function to beauty other than to attract. So if you think of, a peacock or the lion's mane, the purpose of that is to attract, to keep life going past that particular generation. And so I think the natural beauty that is around us is meant for us, first of all, to attract our attention, and then for us to feel that sense of gratitude and thanksgiving. So I wanted to share with you a little bit about the history of that song, because some of you may be saying, oh, I like the song, it's very nice, but, Charlene, you're being a little naive here, a little Pollyanna. Have you not watched the news lately? Have you not seen the conflict that's going on, the suffering? What about the economy? Inflation's up, everything costs more. So, it's a wonderful song, but, it's an older song, and they really were not dealing with anything that, we're dealing with. What we have to deal with in this world right now is much harder. So I want to give you a little bit of perspective. So that song was written in 1967 by Bob Thiel and George David Weiss. And Bob Thiel said that he wrote that song to give hope and comfort to the people who were suffering from the Vietnam War. So if you remember, that was at the height of the war. And many people were suffering from devastating injuries, the loss of loved ones, husbands, fathers, sons, that were never going to come home. And he said, I knew that at that point, I needed to remind all of us of the beautiful world that we live in. It's so true that we can become so focused on what we don't like or what we don't want that we lose sight of the greater picture. And this world is meant to have us experience the full spectrum. So just a little bit of the history of the song too is that it was not a great hit when it came out. In fact, it sold less than 1,000 copies. And the reason was because the record producer, the person who was head of the record company, didn't like the song. He thought it was a little too light. It didn't have a lot of grit to it. And Sean shared with me after the first service an interesting story, and I had read this and I'd forgotten it. But he actually saw Tony Bennett at a function where the children sang this song. And Tony Bennett shared that that was one of the big regrets of his life, was that he was offered that song but didn't take it. And Louis Armstrong took that song and has made it so iconic and so beloved. So the other thing that was going on in 1967 was there were a lot of anti-war demonstrations. One of the largest in history in the US was when 100,000 people gathered at Lincoln Memorial. And then 50,000 people marched to the Pentagon. And there was violence and there was unrest and there was a lot of uneasiness. The other thing that was going on that year was there were over 150 race riots in the US. And I remember watching this as a child on the television. It's very disturbing. And there were cities that were destroyed. The city of Detroit was completely destroyed. Other cities were damaged. There were lives that were lost. So when you think about that, you cannot, stand back and say, well, he was being very naive. He wasn't really, it was a different time. The one thing I will say that has changed since 1967 was that they didn't have the 24-hour news loop, the podcasts, the social media, where we are bombarded with these negative images and these negative messages. That has changed. And so we have to be, in my mind, even more diligent as to what we allow into our consciousness, what images we will allow in. I will not, you can't, in any way make me ever watch a violent movie. That has no interest to me whatsoever. But these images go by so fast that, we have to be very diligent in being careful of what we allow in. So I did share in the first service, if you're ever interested, there's a site called Good News Network. And so every day they publish the good news in the world. Because even when the Vietnam War was going on, when there were riots, all of this unsettled, conflict, there was still kindness. There was still compassion. There were still neighbors helping neighbors. And we can't lose sight of that. So if you're interested in that, check out that site. So Jesus said, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, so that we can discern the will of God, what is good and acceptable." The renewal of the mind, which is to change that, flood of images or those subconscious thoughts that have been programmed into us maybe before the age of 5. The researchers say that most of the thoughts that we have today, we had a week ago, we had 5 years ago. And a lot of them are programmed into us before we're 5 years old. So we don't have any choice about that. But we do have a point of choice when those thoughts come up to the conscious level. And that's when we have to decide what we want to do with them. So Myrtle Fillmore, the co-founder of Unity, talked about the importance of gratitude and thanksgiving. And so this time of year, that's always kind of top of mind for us. And she said that we should be practicing that every day, not just waiting for a national holiday to come about. And she called gratitude and thanksgiving the qualities of the soul. What that means is that that's the very core of us. To feel that connection with God, to feel that sense of gratitude and thanksgiving is our very being. And what happens is that when things are going on, swirling around us in the outer, we lose sight of that. So I shared the definition of the word gratitude. I can't help myself. I love words, and so I always want to really understand what they mean. So the word gratitude came from the Latin word gratia, which means to bestow grace or honor. And gratitude is a thankful appreciation. With gratitude, we acknowledge the goodness in our lives, and then we acknowledge the source of that goodness, which is God. But I have to always think about the opposite of that. And I asked this in the first service, and people kind of looked around a little bit nervously. So I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but I'm going to ask you to be honest with yourselves. How many of you like to complain? Anyone? Don't have to raise your hands. Just be honest with yourselves. We all like to complain. Isn't it just kind of juicy to get with someone and really, talk about how, I call it isn't it awful? This is awful, that's awful, I don't like that, I don't like that. The human brain is really set to make discernment. It's part of our, protection of our life. But what we end up doing is we misuse that powerful energy. I don't know if you're aware of this, but within you, walking around, you have one of the most powerful computing systems in the world. Man has never been able to replicate it. So how we use that, we have to be very careful in where we focus it. If we focus it on what we don't want, what we're frustrated with, guess what? We're going to find more of what we don't want and what we're frustrated with. So Unity teaches what you focus on grows and expands. What you focus on, you attract to you. So do you want to attract more unhappiness and frustration, or do you want to attract what you want? So I wanted to tell this story. A teacher of mine told this story for many years, and it kind of explains a little bit about the idea of complaining. So the researchers say that the typical conversation, there's a complaint every minute. And that sounds like a lot, but I've been in on those conversations, and I think that's probably pretty accurate in most cases. So the story is about a young Catholic priest and he decides that he wants to enter a monastery. And this monastery is a very strict sect. It practices complete silence. So he goes and he talks to the head monk, and the head monk explains this. And he said, every 10 years, you will be allowed to speak 2 words. So the young priest accepts that. He goes about his silent study, his silent work for 10 years. And then he's called to come in front of the head monk and speak his 2 words. And he stands up straight, he looks the head monk right in the eyes, and he says, bed hard. And he goes away, he's dismissed, goes into his silent study, his work for another 10 years. He's called back to the head monk. Once again, he stands straight, looks the head monk right in the eyes, and says, food bad. He goes away, another 10 years, hard study, silence, work. He's called one more time. Comes in front of the head monk, stands very straight, looks in the eye, and says, I quit. And the head monk shakes his head and said, I saw this coming. All you've done for the last 30 years is complain. Right? So I've had a similar experience to this, actually. So I really get a kick out of this story. But for over 20 years, I would go on a silent retreat either once or twice a year. And if you want to get up close and personal with your inner chatter, go somewhere where you're secluded. There's no television, no radios, no telephone, no internet, nothing. And all you are with is yourself in silence. And so I loved it. I would actually, just relish and couldn't wait for the time. And so one year, we were coming out of a couple of days of silence, and there was a group that was gathered in the break room. And I came around the corner and I could hear them talking, and I really could hear what was complaining. So the coffee wasn't, strong enough. They didn't like the morning class. The grass was too wet when we did our meditation, on and on and on. And I just stood there. It was almost like somebody had thrown wet or cold water on my face, because I thought, we're in one of the most beautiful places in the U.S. We have just come out of this sacred experience. We have been provided with everything that we would ever need. And yet you're finding these things to be unhappy about. And it reminded me that we can be in paradise. We can be in a life completely blessed and still not be focused on that. The other story that came to mind was I was whitewater rafting in Colorado one time. And if you've never been whitewater rafting, you'll get a couple of clues of what happened by the very name. You have a raft and you have water, right? Everybody with me here? Okay. So we go on this whitewater rafting. It's absolutely a beautiful, sunshiny day. The water's brisk, I'll say that. And we're just having a heck of a good time. And this woman was so unhappy because she was getting wet. And I remember she was with her teenage daughter and her husband. I've worked with her husband. And her teenage daughter was very upset with her. She said, Mom, you're just making yourself miserable. And I thought, who would go on a whitewater rafting trip and think they might not get wet, right? So we have to think about in terms of what we focus on. Are we focusing on the experience? Are we focusing on our connection with something greater? Or are we focusing on what we don't want? So there's been a lot of research recently on complaining. And scientists are finding that it actually rewires the brain. And what happens is that as you complain, you create these grooves or these pathways in the brain that will cause you to complain more. So some of you may have heard a Sanskrit word, samskara. It's the same idea. It's the idea that there's grooves that are created in the consciousness because of your habitual way of thinking, habitual way of acting. So what happens is that it begins to shrink the hippocampus part of the brain, which is a very important part of the brain in terms of just functioning and memory. The other thing that it does is it increases the stress hormone cortisol. And cortisol results in higher blood pressure, blood sugar, and can result in all sorts of, serious physical issues down the road. The other thing that they found is that because we are inherently social beings, that we kind of tend to find people that think the way that we think. So if we interact and we socialize with people who like to complain, we're more likely to complain. And the analogy that they use is that if you're not a smoker and you're around a smoker, you can still have the health issues from secondhand smoke. Well, complaining is similar. You don't even have to be the person who's speaking the complaining to feel the ill effects of it. So the opposite is true. They're also doing a lot of research on gratitude. The University of California in Davis and the University of Miami has been doing a lot of research in terms of the effects of gratitude. And they use what's called a functional MRI to map the brain. And so one particular study, they had people just write out gratitude lists or gratitude letters, and then they mapped the brain. And they waited 3 months after the letters had been written. And what they found was that those people had more activity in the prefrontal cortex, which is really important in terms of concentration, self-reflection, memory, emotional processing. And the other thing that they found, which is going to sound familiar, is that by at least 24%, their cortisol levels had gone down. So it doesn't take a lot for us to switch from complaining. Well, it takes a little bit of effort, I'm going to say that, from complaining to gratitude, but it doesn't take a lot for us to start feeling the effects from complaining to gratitude. So the other thing that I always talk about is that it's good to give thanks for what we're experiencing right here in this moment. So all of us are in this beautiful sanctuary, surrounded by these beautiful grounds. This moment is good. But we also need to give thanks for that which we were holding for, that which we were praying. As I shared in the meditation, Charles Fillmore talked a lot about substance and how we mold substance into being through our faith. So there's many examples of Jesus in the Bible who gave thanks in advance. You remember the feeding of the thousands. He held the few provisions up and said, "Thank you, God." He didn't wait until all of the food had been brought. He didn't wait until all the thousands had been fed. He gave thanks in advance. Same is true of the rising of Lazarus out of the tomb. He said, "Father, I know that you hear me, that you always hear me. I thank you." He gave thanks before the healing took place. He gave thanks before Lazarus walked out of the tomb. He gave thanks in advance for what he was praying for, what he was holding for. So we should give thanks for the healing. We should give thanks for the job. We should give thanks for the healthy relationships. Whatever it is that we are trying to bring into our world, start with thanks. Recognize it as a blessing that's coming forth, part of the goodness that's coming forth. So this is a quote from Charles Fillmore. "The highest form of prayer is to open our mind and quietly realize that the one omnipresent intelligence knows our thoughts and instantly answers, even before we have audibly expressed our desires. This being true, we should ask and at the same time give thanks that we have already received. If God instantly answers, then we should instantly give thanks. So it's that idea of what Emily Cady talks about in Lessons in Truth. Desire, in Latin, of, desire, God. Desire is of God. And as she said, desire is God knocking on the door of our consciousness, knowing what we want to bring forth. And so for us, it's about opening our awareness to that goodness, whatever it is. And I also wanted to share this quote from Mary Pepperly, who's one of my favorite authors. She was a minister here for many years. She says, this is from her book, God Will See You Through. The very cells of our bodies need to hear, thank you, God. Thank you, God. Thank you, God. Say these words when you feel well and when you do not. When you feel lost and when you feel assured. When you do not know the way to go and when you do. When you laugh and when you cry. When you feel filled with faith and especially when you do not. Persist, persist until your heart begins to feel alive and everything in you begins to ring with joy. You know, I read that many years ago, and it didn't really, I loved it, and I have kept that book close all these years. I used to have, actually, I'm going to date myself, I used to have a cassette player back in the days when I used to run, and I would listen to Mary's voice reading some of those passages. But what finally kind of dawned on me one day is that thank you, God, thank you, God, thank you, God. It's not even that we're saying thank you, God, for the brand new job or the brand new car or whatever it is. We are just appreciating and bestowing that appreciation on God. And I've shared this many times in Prosperity Coffee. I live in a townhouse, so there's 16 stairs that go all the way down to the ground floor. And I used to find myself, you know, rushing out of the door, being late to go somewhere, and, you know, being in a bad mood. And one day it dawned on me to say, thank you, God, as I went down the stairs. And I can't tell you how all of a sudden I started to feel very calm. I was no longer feeling rushed or, oh my gosh, how am I going to get there on time? I just released all of that by just taking those few moments to say thank you, God. And part of Thanksgiving is not only saying that or thinking that. You know, when Kathy Beasley was here last week, she talked about random acts of kindness, basically. But we have to have that feeling nature, what I call a grateful heart. Our feeling nature is what connects us with God. You know, we can say these things, we can read books, we can listen to people talk, but until we really take this in and we take it as part of who we really are, and we feel that presence of God, and we feel that gratitude, then it stays kind of up here. So I think they say there's 18 inches between the human brain and the human heart, but it's one of the longest journeys we'll ever take. It begins with practice. It begins with being willing to cultivate a grateful heart. So I wanted to give you a few ways that you can do that. First of all, when you become aware of a negative thought or a complaining thought, instantly replace it. That's what we teach in Unity. You know, take an affirmation, take the opposite thought, and repeat that to yourself. Emmett Fox, one of my favorite authors, he wrote about the 7-day mental diet. He has a little brochure on it. And so his take on it is that, you know, we know how important a healthy diet is to our physical well-being. The same is true of our mental well-being. We have to make sure that what we're allowing to come into our consciousness is good for us, is healthy for us. And so his idea is that you take 7 days, and every time that you notice a negative thought, that you then say, or you can release it, but you don't bring it in and entertain it. You don't dwell on it. So when I read that, I got the image of, a negative thought comes knocking on your door and you welcome it in and you have it, you have a seat at the table for it and you set a beautiful setting. That's kind of what we do with our negative thoughts. We make it way too welcoming. When, if somebody came to your door and they were threatening or somebody you didn't really like, would you be that welcoming? No. But we do that with our negative thoughts. So that's his take on it. The other is create a gratitude journal. Write 3 or 5 things that you're grateful for every day. And I can give you a tip on how to fall asleep and sleep really well at night. Right before you go to sleep, think of 3 things you're grateful for. Or say, thank you, God. You will be amazed at how that transforms your sleep. The other is to write a letter to God giving thanks. May McCarthy, she was here a number of years ago, spoke at our church a couple of times, and we studied her book in prosperity, um, the gratitude formula. And she said every morning, write a letter to God. She called it your chief spiritual officer. And I did that for 2 years, and I can tell you it completely transformed my life. I've gotten away from it, and I thought this morning I need to start that again. And what I found is when I went back and I looked at the book that I had written in, it was amazing at all the things that had come about that at the time seemed kind of far-fetched. Another idea is to write thank you notes to people who do something for you. One of the things I didn't mention, the studies show that if you're in a relationship, show gratitude and thanksgiving to that person. It sounds like kind of a no-brainer, right? But we don't always do that. We don't always take the time. And what they found is that when you do that, when struggles or challenges come up in the relationship, both parties are more willing to work on it. The last one is to pray, to tell God what you're thankful for, to tell God of your many blessings. So I wanted to leave you with this quote from Michael Josephson. He's an author. He started a group that focuses on the ethical behavior in the world. And this is what he says. The world has enough beautiful mountains and meadows, spectacular skies and serene lakes. It has enough lush forests, flowered fields, and sandy beaches. It has plenty of stars and the promise of a new sunrise and sunset every day. What the world needs more of is people to appreciate and enjoy it. So not only for this week of Thanksgiving, but beyond, what my prayer is for you is that you appreciate and you enjoy the world and the people in your world every day. And don't pass by an opportunity to say thanks. And remember that it is really a wonderful world. So thank you very much, and happy Thanksgiving.